The Black Death didn't originate in Europe or even along the Black Sea coast. It began in Central Asia, close to Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, a full decade before it reached the Mediterranean. The genetic data also revealed something that scientists describe as a big bang of diversification. In the early 14th century, this ancestral strain underwent rapid evolutionary branching, splitting into multiple lineages simultaneously. One of those lineages would go on to cause the Black Death in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Another would persist in rodent populations across Central Asia. The branching pattern, visible in the genetic data, matches precisely the timeline suggested by the Kyrgyzstan cemetery evidence. A massive ecological event in the early 1330s that allowed the plague to explode from its animal reservoir into human populations, and then to diversify rapidly as it spread. The modern descendants of the pre-pandemic Yersinia pestis lineage mainly come from wild animals very near the Kyrgyzstan site. This suggests the Kyrgyzstan plague arose locally, spilling over from local populations of marmots into the human population, and from there moving west. This is where the ecology of the region becomes critical to understanding the full story. The mountains around Lake Issyk-Kul are what scientists call a natural plague reservoir. Yersinia pestis circulates quietly among wild rodents in this region, marmots, great gerbils, voles, moving back and forth between them through flea bites. These animals have coexisted with the bacterium for long enough that they rarely die from it. They are carriers, passing it along through their fleas, maintaining it in the wild animal population for years, for decades, for centuries, without it ever reaching humans. In most years, the plague stays locked inside this hidden animal world, completely invisible and completely harmless to people. The Karadzic community was not isolated. Archaeologists found pearls from the Indian Ocean, silver coins from Iran, and ceramics from the Mediterranean in those same graves. These were merchants, traders, middlemen, and one of the most sophisticated commercial networks in the medieval world. Camel caravans passed through carrying spices and textiles westward, and those same caravans carried black rats, the species that served as the primary amplifying host for plague-infected fleas, which thrived in the grain sacks and animal fodder that provisioned every caravan stop along the route. The spread was not the explosive, fast-moving wave that most people imagine. It was slow, methodical, moving oasis to oasis, town to town, following the Silk Road westward across thousands of miles of steppe and mountain and desert. Each new stop on the route was a new opportunity for infected rats and their fleas to establish themselves. Each new outbreak produced new infected humans, some of whom traveled onward before their symptoms appeared. And by the mid-1340s, the plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula, the critical gateway between the Asian steppe and the Mediterranean world. What happened at the Crimean port city of Kaffa in 1346 is one of the most disturbing episodes in medieval military history. Kaffa was controlled by Genoese merchants, the most powerful trading network in the Mediterranean, and it came under siege by the Mongol army of the Golden Horde. The Mongols had a catastrophic problem. Plague was tearing through their own ranks. Soldiers were dying in enormous numbers. And then came the moment that Italian notary Gabriele de Musi recorded for posterity. The Mongol commanders ordered the corpses of plague victims to be loaded into catapults and hurled over the walls of the besieged city. Whether this was deliberate biological warfare or simply a brutal attempt to demoralize the defenders, the effect was identical. Plague entered Kaffa. The Genoese merchants who fled from Kaffa's docks in 1347 carried more than passengers and cargo in their holds. Black rats, their fleas loaded with Yersinia pestis, made the journey across the Mediterranean. Ship after ship docked in port after port, Messina, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and in each harbor, the rats and their fleas went ashore. Europe in 1347 was perfectly primed for catastrophe. Crowded medieval cities with no understanding of germ theory, no concept of quarantine, no effective medical response. Dense populations of black rats living alongside dense populations of humans, sanitation systems that concentrated filth and vermin together, and a population with no previous exposure to this particular strain of plague, meaning no acquired immunity anywhere in the population. The wave moved with terrifying speed. Within months of the first Sicilian infections, plague was spreading through Italy. Within a year, it had crossed the Alps. Within 2 years, it had reached England, Scandinavia, and the edges of Russia. The Black Death killed its victims in 3 to 5 days from first symptoms. Symptoms of bubonic plague included painful and enlarged swollen lymph nodes, headaches, chills, fatigue, vomiting, and fevers. And within 3 to 5 days, 80% of the victims would be dead. Some cities lost more than half their populations before the wave finally passed. Some villages were abandoned entirely. Every resident dead, no one left to tell what had happened. And then, in the aftermath of unimaginable death, something happened that scientists only understood in 2022, nearly 700 years after the events, when a second landmark, ancient DNA study published in the journal Nature, revealed a biological consequence of the Black Death that is still affecting millions of living people today. The same genes that once conferred protection against the Black Death are today associated with an increased susceptibility to autoimmune diseases. This study was published in October 2022 in the journal Nature. Here's what that means. When plague killed 30 to 50% of the population in just a few years, it did not kill randomly. Some people survived. And the question the researchers asked was, why did those specific people survive when so many others died? The researchers identified genetic variants that helped the immune system fight the Black Death. People with protective versions of certain genes were more likely to survive and pass on those variants to future generations. The team analyzed ancient DNA from 206 individuals buried in 3 cemeteries in London. People who died before the plague, people who died during the Black Death, and people who died after it, looking for genetic differences between the groups. They found clear signatures of natural selection. Certain immune gene variants became dramatically more common in the population after the plague. When a pandemic of this nature, killing 30 to 50% of the population, occurs, there is bound to be selection for protective alleles in humans. People susceptible to the circulating pathogen will succumb. Even a slight advantage means the difference between surviving or passing. Those survivors who are of breeding age will pass on their genes. The specific gene they identified is called ERAP2. People who carried a particular version of this gene had a significantly higher chance of surviving the Black Death. Their immune systems were better equipped to recognize and fight Yersinia pestis. In the centuries after the Black Death, this protective variant became far more common in European populations because the people who carried it survived, reproduced, and passed it to their children. Natural selection at its most brutal and most direct. An entire pandemic reshaping the genetic makeup of human populations in a matter of decades. But the same genes that once conferred protection against the Black Death are today associated with an increased susceptibility to autoimmune diseases such as Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. The gene that protected medieval Europeans from plague makes their modern descendants more vulnerable to diseases, where the immune system attacks the body itself. Evolution optimized the human immune system for the worst threat it had ever faced, and that optimization created trade-offs that are still playing out in hospital wards today. If you or someone you know has Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, or certain other autoimmune conditions, there's a real chance that one distant ancestor survived the Black Death specifically because they carried the immune gene variant that is now contributing to that disease. The plague reached forward across 700 years and is still shaping human health in the present. The social and economic consequences of the Black Death were equally profound and equally long-lasting. By radically increasing the relative price of labor relative to land in areas that had experienced demographic collapse, the Black Death fundamentally reshaped economic realities. Laborers had significantly more bargaining power and much greater mobility, conditions that ultimately led to the demise of serfdom. For most of the medieval period, peasants were bound to the land. They owed labor to their lords. They could not leave. They had no negotiating power over their own lives. When the Black Death killed half the workforce, that system collapsed almost overnight. Dead peasants cannot farm. Lords who needed their remaining serfs to actually work the land suddenly had to offer wages, better conditions, reduced obligations. The survivors discovered, in the wreckage of everything they had known, that their labor was suddenly valuable in a way it had never been before. The Black Death altered the fundamental paradigm of European life, completely overwhelming medieval society and leaving no way for the people to resume life as they had previously known it. Culturally, the plague produced one of the most distinctive aesthetic periods in human history. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a recurring image in European art and literature. A skeletal figure leading processions of people from every rank of society, king and peasant alike, to their graves. Death had stopped being abstract. It had walked every street. It had taken the highest nobility and the lowest beggar with equal indifference. The idea that wealth or status or piety could protect anyone had been comprehensively destroyed. Entire religious movements emerged from the trauma. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of mass penance, believing the plague was a punishment from heaven and that physical suffering might earn mercy. Jewish communities across Europe were massacred by their neighbors, scapegoated for a disease that nobody understood, and that needed an explanation someone could point to and blame. The long shadow of those 1,338 graves in Kyrgyzstan stretched across centuries in every direction. Through the political upheaval that ended feudalism, through the artistic obsession with mortality that defined late medieval culture, through the religious crisis that would eventually contribute to the Reformation, through the immune system of every person of European descent alive today who carries the genetic legacy of those who survived. And the discovery itself, the 2022 breakthrough that finally identified the origin, carries its own lesson, one that is worth sitting with for a moment. The bones had been sitting in St. Petersburg for more than 130 years before anyone connected them to the Black Death. Now, the tombstones with the word pestilence carved on them had been photographed and recorded in the 1880s. The information was there. It was in the archives. It was in the museum storage rooms. What was missing was the technology to read what the bones were saying, and one historian curious enough to go looking in places other researchers had overlooked. Philip Slavin came across the graveyard records by chance while researching the economic and environmental history of the Black Death. By chance. One of the most significant scientific breakthroughs in the history of epidemiology began because a medieval historian happened to notice a set of old excavation reports buried deep in an archive and recognized that the dates and that single word, pestilence, were worth a second look. Science is often presented as a story of grand planned programs and well-funded institutional searches for answers. The Black Death origin story is something messier and more human than that. It is a story of curiosity following a thread that most people would have set down. The same forces that unleashed this pandemic in 1338 have not gone away. Since the Kyrgyzstan site is close to ancient trade routes between Eastern Asia and Europe, trade played a role in spreading this strain of plague. Today, those trade routes are jet aircraft carrying millions of passengers a day across every continent. The Silk Road caravans that moved plague from Lake Issyk-Kul to the Black Sea in years took those same distances and turned them into hours. An infected person boarding a flight today reaches the other side of the world before a single symptom appears. The ecological disruptions that allowed plague to spill from marmots into humans in the 1330s, climate shifts, rodent population explosions, humans moving into animal habitats, are happening today at a scale that would be unrecognizable to any medieval observer. The zoonotic spillover events that gave us Ebola, SARS, and COVID-19 follow the exact same pattern as the event that filled those Kyrgyzstan graves in 1338. The graves near Lake Issyk-Kul hold the remains of traders and merchants and their families who had no idea what had entered their community. They were people who lived ordinary lives on a major trade route, who bought and sold goods, who carved their loved ones' names on stones and noted the cause of death with a word that carried enormous weight: pestilence. They were trying to record what had happened. They were trying to make sense of it, and their attempt to record it, preserved in stone, transported to a museum, sitting untouched for more than a century, eventually became the key that unlocked one of history's longest-standing mysteries. 3 of the 7 people whose teeth scientists examined in 2022 carried the genetic fingerprint of Yersinia pestis, 3 people who died in 1338 or 1339 at the edge of a mountain lake in Central Asia. Their DNA, preserved inside their teeth for 680 years, answered the question that historians and scientists had been arguing about for centuries. The Black Death began here. It began with a climate shift and a rodent population boom and a single zoonotic spillover event in a region that happened to sit at the crossroads of the most connected trade network in the medieval world. And it ended, that first catastrophic wave, only after it had killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of every human being it reached. The science that found the answer is the same science that is now watching for the next emergence. The paleogenomics that read 680-year-old DNA from ancient teeth is the same technology that sequences new pathogens in real time. The ecological understanding of how climate shifts create conditions for zoonotic spillover is being applied right now to regions where plague reservoirs still exist, where rodent populations are expanding, where human activity is pushing deeper into habitats that have belonged to wild animals for thousands of years. The tombstones in Kyrgyzstan, inscribed in Syriac language, had been a cornerstone of controversy among scholars for over a century regarding their relevance to the Black Death of Europe. That controversy is now resolved. The answer was always there, carved in stone, waiting for science that did not yet exist to come and read what the dead were trying to say. They were saying, "It started here. It started with us. And now you know."